This is Still Enrolled.
And welcome on into the latest edition of Still Enrolled, a Big Ten football podcast. As always, Ryan Hickey, Ryan Tripp with you here. As Tripp, we are now inching closer to the college football playoff semifinal games. Penn State, Notre Dame, Ohio State, Texas, right around the corner. On Monday, in case you missed our pod, we gave a big breakdown, our preview, our predictions, our analysis of both of these games. Go check it out on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Of course, the name's Still Enrolled. Today, we promised you we'd give you a behind enemy lines look at these two games as Tony Simeone, what a great name, by the way, rolls right off the tongue, Notre Dame radio play-by-play man will join us to give the Notre Dame perspective as they look to take on and beat Penn State and vice versa. Fozzy Whittaker, former Texas running back, will join us as well to give us the Longhorns perspective as they get set to take on Ohio State. Tripp, I'm really excited to get some insight, hear some differing perspectives, because we are in agreement, right? We both think Penn State and Ohio State are going to win these games. I'm really excited to hear the other side of the coin and how they view Notre Dame and Texas's perspectives, view these games, to see if maybe they agree with what we're saying, or maybe there's something we're missing that we should keep an eye on here for Thursday or Friday.
And as we record this part of the podcast, we both have the benefit of already knowing what Tony and Fozzy say in these interviews. And I'll tell you, there is nothing in those interviews that you're about to hear that changes my mind on how the games will be played, what the games look like in terms of offense versus defense, offense, the matchups of the game, the style of play that the games have, the personality the games take on. There's nothing in these interviews that really changes my mind about when we talked on Monday, how I felt about these games. Great perspectives, but I keep looking at it and I think Penn State's slightly favored in my mind over Notre Dame, more avenues to win, and Ohio State's just so hot right now. You have to put together a great game plan or you have to out-talent them to win. So I'm listening when we talk to Tony and Fozzy, like, oh, yeah, you know what? That changes my mind on this matchup. You're around that team all the time. You have a better pulse on it. You know the buzz, you know the feel. And I don't get that. Like maybe as you listen to this today, maybe you take that, but that's how I approach not only asking the questions, but listening to their answers is, can you change my mind on how I feel about these games? And I learned a lot from the interviews, but I didn't learn anything that convinced me that I should feel differently than I did on Monday.
Both are great. And I think both gave some interesting matchups to keep an eye on, to where if, like you said, if Notre Dame is to pull off an upset, even though they're technically the Vegas favorites, but at least in our mind, pull off an upset. And if Texas is able to pull off an upset, both Tony and Fozzy, I think, gave good matchups to keep an eye on to where that could happen. So that's definitely, I think, just great insight there. And I think, like I said, both were tremendous. Before we get to Tony Simeone first here, as we're going time order with the Orange Bowl being on Thursday, Cotton Bowl being on Friday, I got to say, I mean, the beautiful background, Chip. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see it. I see you've already made it down to Miami. You're recording this on Wednesday morning, about a day and a half away from the Orange Bowl. You got down there on Tuesday. What's the vibe like? Is there already sort of a buzz, 2 days out from the Orange Bowl? What's the first 12 hours, 24 hours or so been like for you right now in beautiful, and I mean beautiful, Miami?
Well, I was on a commercial flight down Tuesday on a flight they added direct from Harrisburg to Miami, and the flight was obviously filled with Penn State fans, to the point where you get on and someone grabs the microphone and starts a "We Are" chant. I will say this. So there were a couple other staff members that were on the plane. And then I'm flying with Steve Jones, the great 25-year play-by-play voice of Penn State football. And so we walk into the terminal, and all of a sudden, 1, 2, 3 people come up to him and they're like, "So tell me about the game. Tell me about the game." So we're there probably about an hour early. And, I'm kind of standing there, half amused, half like, okay, I got to help my guy out here a little bit. So I go, "Steve, didn't you want to go grab breakfast before we get on the plane?" So he's like, "Absolutely." And we walk down we go, there's kind of like a little Starbucks. We got like a little apple Danish. And I'm like, "Why don't we sit here around the corner behind the Starbucks?" And so we're sitting there eating, and he goes, "I know what you did there. Thank you. So it was like you enjoy it. He enjoys it. He's great with the fans. I'm not saying he's not great with the fans, but it was like, 10 in the morning on a Tuesday. It's snowing, it's cold, and it was just one of those where you kind of just need to find your
No one
space.
came up to you, Tripp. That's Brian Tripp of Still Enrolled fame. We got to get our podcast up, man.
Well,
I thought that's what you were going to say. You're going to get mobbed.
I think a lot of people are listening on Spotify, Apple, or wherever they get their podcasts. They're not watching the YouTube page. So, like, if I spoke loudly in the terminal, everyone would be like, "Oh my gosh, that's Brian Tripp. That's his voice. I know that high pitched squeal from anywhere." But no, Miami. Actually, last night this is not a complaint. Needed a jacket when we went to dinner, but there's a lot of football fans, but it's so big. Like, it's such a big spread out area. I'm staying about an hour, 45 minutes to an hour from the stadium. Penn State staying in Miami, Notre Dame staying in Fort Lauderdale. And I think with it being on a Thursday, what's unique about it is this is not over New Year's. This isn't a holiday week anymore. So the sense I got is a lot of people are kind of coming in today, Wednesday, for the game. They'll be here tonight, be here Thursday, and get out of here on Friday unless they can turn into a long weekend after the game. But people are back to work now and actually do have lives and jobs. So it's hard to – people are coming here. It's going to be an awesome environment, place sold out. But I think it's different because now you're in that playoff semifinal as opposed to your traditional like Orange Bowl over the new year where people have time to come and make a vacation out of it. I'm coming to see this game because it's going to be a hell of a football game.
Well, I'm glad you didn't get mobbed because you guys have that voice. We need you for here on Wednesday. We need you obviously on the broadcast as well. You can't be sitting there gabbing for 3 hours about a game in a terminal 2 days before the game starts. So I'm glad the fans were respectful enough to say, okay, let's talk to Steve. Brian's got to save his voice here for a big podcast.
I think
thank you. Thank you to the listeners here for sparing Tripp. But Tripp, let's get to Tony. Tony was awesome. Gives us a great perspective. He's down there in Miami as well, getting set from the Notre Dame side as Notre Dame does take on Penn State. Tony Simeone, voice of Notre Dame football, previews this game right now.
As we continue our preview episode of these national semifinals here on Still Enrolled, a Big Ten football podcast, we get the perspective of the Notre Dame Fighting Irish with no one better than the voice of the Fighting Irish himself, Tony Simeone. Tony, just saw you the other day out in South Bend for some hockey. You have a crazy schedule. I think it's crazier than mine right now. We do appreciate the time.
Yes, and the schedule is crazy right now, Brian. I know it is for you as well, but I think these are great problems to have, right? I mean, we're covering two teams in the semifinal. You and I are lucky enough to get to cover college hockey as well. You can't complain at this time of year. And even though there's a lack of sleep, all these things that normally would be worthy of complaints when they're because of what we're getting to do, it's great. It's so fun. And I just can't wait until Thursday. It's going to be awesome.
The beauty is when I get home, I don't have, it's a blessing for you, but at this time of year, maybe a little less sleep because of the baby at home.
Yeah, the 6-month-old, it's good it's not a 6-week-old. I'll put it that way. We're getting more sleep than then. This would be a real test for me and my wife if it was back in like July. But no, this is, we're getting less sleep because of the baby as well. But again, like a good problem to have. We've got the baby. So it's great. It's all good here. And it's going to be a fun week.
For our listeners to really give a full capsule of the Notre Dame season, after week 2 and the loss at home to NIU, what's happened since then and what's allowed this team to persevere and really play as dominant as any team in college football since?
Yeah, I think Marcus Freeman deserves the most credit at the top because he's had a couple of disappointing losses now in his 3 years at Notre Dame. He's been very good about just being introspective and accountable when they lose and don't meet the standard they've set. Came right after that game and said that maybe they believed too much of the hype from week 1, beating Texas A&M on the road, let it go to their heads a little bit, and maybe didn't prepare the way they have to. And then he's used that NIU game throughout the year, every week, to remind them, if you do what you did against Northern Illinois, anybody can beat you. And they basically use that to ensure that nobody has beaten them since. And the wins have gotten more impressive here in the back half of the year with USC, IU, and now Georgia all in a row. And the schedule up until that point, one of the flaws or one of the things people would point to is the schedule wasn't that tough. Some of that they couldn't control. But the way they were beating teams, I think, was proving to themselves and to others that they were to be taken seriously. I mean, they were beating down opponents. None of these games were really close in the end, with the exception of a Louisville game at the end of September. And then along with that was Riley Leonard, I think, has just gotten better as well. And I think that Mike Denbrock, the offensive coordinator, has gotten on the same page with him in a way that they're calling a game now here. It'll be game 15 way differently than they did in game 2 against NIU. So there's just a comfort level with everyone in the offense. He missed spring ball. So some of those reps probably they'd like to have gotten out of the way in March and April. They were having to take in live game action against NIU. And so they've been able to, I think, get to a place they're all really comfortable with. He only threw it for 90 yards against Georgia, but he ran it for 80, protected the ball. The approach was way more on the same page by design than they were in that NIU game. And that maturation from everyone on the offense, I think, is what shined through.
Tony, too, when you look at Notre Dame this year, this feels like the most legit Notre Dame has been in a while, where they've, had a lot of regular season success, but then you get to a big bowl game, they lose. In most cases, get blown out. Like, is there a difference you see with this year's Notre Dame team where they're able to beat Georgia and now are one win away from the national title?
Yeah, it's interesting because someone was making the comment to me today. They're like, Notre Dame's been to this stage of the CFP before. They've been to the semifinal in 18 and 20, and they were undefeated going into those. They didn't have an NIU loss, and yet it feels different. It feels like they're better than they have been in those years. And I think it's twofold. One is, I think this year is unique in college football that there just doesn't, and maybe Ohio State is kind of becoming this team, it seems like. But at least right now, there's not a team that's going to be, I don't think, like a wide margin favorite in any of the games the rest of the way. And it's been like that the whole year. So the playing field is flatter than it has been. That's why it feels like they've got as good a shot as they've had, probably a better shot than when they had to go play Alabama in 2012 in that game when they did go undefeated and were playing the BCS title game back then. And then the second thing is, I do think that on top of all that, this is as deep as Notre Dame has been in a long time. This is my first year doing football play-by-play, but I've been here since 2016. And this is, of course, Marcus Freeman's third year. The depth they have, they've lost a ton of guys on defense, 4 of their top 7 or 8 players. And the reserves have come in and made huge plays in the Sugar Bowl. That just was not the case in 2020. I mean, the top line guys struggled enough with Alabama or with Clemson in 18. This is now your, 2 and they're 3 deep at defensive end, going up and, making big plays, sniffing out screens against Georgia. The thought of them doing that against the SEC champions as recently as 5 years ago, it seemed like there was too wide of a gap to bridge, and they've bridged that. So Marcus Freeman, Chad Bowden, who's their general manager, a former director of recruiting, now kind of manages all personnel. They've done a great job of piecing this team together in a way that you have to in the new college football landscape. And the last thing I'll say on that is that I think the whole department, and you guys, I'm sure, have been covering this as well, just like the way college football has changed, Notre Dame, there's a world in which they could have not been willing to adapt. And they've been really open and have found a way to adapt while still managing within the parameters that they want to operate in as a university. And it's been, I think, really neat to see them navigate it in their own unique way. And the product is now bearing out on the field. It's something that I think they should all be really proud of.
Tony, it's so interesting you said that, because we were just talking about the landscape of college football earlier this week on our podcast and discussing how the SEC maybe used to get away with it because they didn't have the same standards that schools in the Big Ten or a school like Notre Dame would have. And now the playing field's level because it's legal for everyone to do what maybe some of those SEC schools or other teams were unwilling to do, or at least unwilling publicly to do as much as others in the past. So I'm not going to ask you to comment on that any further. It's just an aside from a conversation that we had earlier this week. We want to get to know Notre Dame. Personality of this defense. When we looked at Penn State earlier this year, Ohio State's defense gave them trouble because the corners were really physical on the outside against Penn State's wide receivers. They were overmatched, and then took away Tyler Warren for the quarterback Drew Aller, who wanted to go to his tight end and his favorite target. What's the person, like, we can look at the numbers and see why this Notre Dame defense is so good at all 3 levels. What's the personality of this defense for fans who haven't seen Notre Dame, maybe besides watching part of the Georgia game or part of the USC game a few weeks ago, Indiana? Like, what's the personality? What drives them?
It's a great question. And I think watching it last week was like the big litmus test for me, because I'd seen it against teams and everyone says, Indiana wasn't that good or USC's down this year. But you guys know Indiana was still a good team. They're not nearly as bad as everyone made them out to be. USC has tons of talent, but still, Georgia's a different beast, right? And that's SEC and SEC champs, and they flew around against Georgia. So personality-wise, it kind of reminds me of like what you'd expect to see from an SEC defense. Kirby Smart in his press conference before the game last week referred to them as they look like they have SEC athletes on their team. And so when you think beyond that, I think they're violent. Marcus Freeman's used that word a couple times in the sense that they go out and they hit you hard. And then the linebackers, I think, actually get overlooked. So the corners have been great. Benjamin Morrison, their star corners out. But Leonard Moore and Christian Gray are probably able to go man-to-man with most anyone. But the linebackers, Jack Kaiser's a sixth year, and then you've got Drake Bowen, who's a sophomore. Jaden Osbury is a really good dynamic corner and I don't know anything about the scheme, but he's the guy they've had out there sometimes playing like a big nickel who you might see get the first chance against Warren. I would just say they're more athletic than you might expect. It's, when you think Midwest football, you might not just think rangy, long, athletic, but they have rangy, long, athletic guys. And so I think, expect if you're a Penn State fan or you're a Big Ten fan that hasn't seen them much, don't expect maybe what you used to see from Notre Dame. Expect something more from down south, if that makes any sense from a personality standpoint.
How much do they blitz? Penn State really struggled against the blitz against Boise. How often do they blitz, and do they need to because what they have up front? Who are the edge rushers to watch for?
Yeah, I wish I had a number on where they rank. From my just perspective, I don't think they blitz all that much. They like to trust their guys in coverage. That said, Al Golden, when he does blitz, it seems like they always get home. It's usually a pretty conventional blitz. There's kind of like a notorious double safety blitz he brought in his first game 3 years ago against Ohio State at Ohio State that they got burned on. Otherwise, kept that game pretty close. And I don't think we've seen the double safety blitz since. They've kind of rebranded. I do know they play, I believe, the most man, or maybe the second behind Purdue, the most man coverage in the country. So that tells you they trust their corners, they trust their system, and they trust their guys up front for the most part to get home, which has been the most surprising thing for me. Right. Boubacar Traore, a guy who I think is going to be a future pro, out for the year after the first month of the season with an injury. Jordan Botello, a veteran fifth-year guy, goes out. Those are supposed to be two of their top four pass rushers, and they've still just found guys. Junior Tui Alamaka on the edge now. RJ Oben had the big strip sack in the Sugar Bowl. He's a transfer from Duke. They've been kind of waiting for all year to get going. So it was great to see him show up. If he does it again in the Orange Bowl, that's a huge bonus. And then Bryce Young, who's Bryant Young, the Hall of Famer's son, has been great on specials, blocking kicks. But he is someone that if you get him on the field and can get him in the right matchup, he can give you some really valuable reps to get to the quarterback. So the long-winded answer I just gave you, the short one is they don't blitz a ton, but when they do, it seems to be pretty tactical, and they usually get home.
You mentioned SEC athletes, right? Notre Dame has, caliber-wise on their defense. And the guy I think that everyone's going to try to stop Tony in this game is probably Tyler Warren, right? The do-it-all tight end for Penn State. Does Notre Dame have like a guy that they can maybe put on him, try to take him away? Or is that going to be more just coverage by committee, 2-3 guys, multiple sets of eyes on Tyler Warren, who we've seen this year literally line up every single possible position you could put a tight end in?
Yeah, I would love to ask Al Golden and just have him tell me. And I'm sure he wouldn't. Yeah, clearly nobody's quite figured it out, right? So I don't know what the answer is. I think, again, this is me, the play-by-play guy with no play calling experience. I like the idea of Osbury getting the first crack. That's the most conventional option, right? It's your biggest athletic and speediest linebacker. Can you hold up? But then I think it is going to be by committee. The secondary will be involved. Listen, Xavier Watts might be the best safety in the country. There's got to be a role for him when the tight end's streaking free, right? There's got to be a role for a Don Schuler, who's the strong safety. I'd be fascinated if they had Benjamin Morrison, their best corner at the start of the year. Like if they split him out wide, do you send your best corner to him for a couple plays? Just mix it up, try to take him out of the passing game entirely with someone super athletic. I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's Osbury, it's Watts. Jack Kaiser, their veteran linebacker, he has been in coverage. I think he can, but it's not the kind of thing you're going to see him follow him around. They're going to have to be, to your point, kind of by committee. They're interchangeable enough across the board at that position group that I don't think you'll see anyone just tailgating the whole time. They're going to have to mix it up, and they have to be exotic with their scheme, right? I know they play the most man in the country, I can't imagine they're going to play every down man. They're going to mix it up sometimes just so they don't get comfortable seeing the same look.
Has Notre Dame faced many opponents that use a lot of motion, different personnel formations? Is there anything you could compare Penn State and all the stuff, the window dressing, the tight end taking snaps, the running back taking snaps, the quarterback lining up in the slot? Like, is there anyone that they've played that you can compare it to?
There's nothing necessarily like that. They're unique in that sense. But I think what helps them is that every year they play Navy, and then this year they played Army. So these triple option attacks, you have to be ready to install something unique on a short timeline. And now they have the advantage that in the spring, they know it's coming, so they can prep guys in a way. But the fact of the matter is, game ends on Saturday. You just played spread offense against Team X. You got to come and get ready for triple option. And scout team has to be different. You have to be really efficient in how you prepare, right? So what I would say is that their ability to turn around for a new opponent is probably as good as anybody in the country, just because they have to every year. And they had to get ready for option, go back and get ready for option again this year. So I know this is not the triple option, obviously, but as Al Golden and his staff have then diagnosed what they have to be ready for and install, I would imagine they're going to be able to get ready for it as much as anybody in the country because they're used to kind of changing in and out throughout the year. So I think that's a benefit. But no, they've not seen anything like this. And quite frankly, I'm excited to see what they do, because if there is one thing Al Golden's been awesome at this entire run at Notre Dame, it's that whatever's been thrown at his defense, and they might actually give you the first drive. I ran the numbers at one point. They're giving up like 4.5 points per first drive, and then like less than a point the rest of the drives per year. He's going to let you show your cards, and he might give you something, but for the most part, after that first drive, they really shut you down. So that first drive, I want to see what happens. And if Penn State gets 7, you won't see Notre Dame fans flinch. It's if they get 14 in the first 2 drives, then you might think, okay, wait a second. But once he sees your cards, he's been really good this year.
On the flip side, Tony, you look at, Penn State's defense versus Notre Dame's offense. Big question mark, big storyline going in this game is injuries, right? Obviously, everyone's watching Abdul Carter's status, as everyone's watching Jeremiah Love's injury status. With Notre Dame being such a run-heavy offense, let's just say if Love is not 100% in this game, how does that impact, if at all, Notre Dame's game planning and their identity going to this one here on Thursday?
Yeah, I think it totally changes everything. I think that you saw Riley Leonard ran it 14 times against Georgia, and that's because Love only ran it 6 times. I think most of the carries actually end up in Riley Leonard's hands. I think I always think the perfect game for Notre Dame in the playoffs, I think I said this was Love runs it 15 times, Price runs it 10 times, Leonard runs it 8 times. And there's a couple extra, you get to 35 that way. Well, if you got to get to 35 and I don't know what Love's going to be able to give you, you have to just, I think, shift whatever he's not giving you to Leonard. And they do run a lot of design quarterback runs, specifically in short down, right? 2nd and 3, 3rd and 3, you can expect Leonard's basically just your power back. But without Love, you're lacking, I think, one of the best backs in the country. And quite frankly, the last 2 games, he had the big 98-yarder against IU. Every other carry, he has not really looked like himself since USC. So if you're looking at a silver lining for Notre Dame fans, maybe you just go into this game not expecting to have that best version of him, and you're game planning in a way that accounts for that. Maybe you haven't to this point in the season. That could be one thing to look out for. Jadarian Price is really good. I mean, if he's the bell cow in this game, he's capable of going for 100 yards, getting to the edge. He has great speed. So I think you'll see most of that translate to Leonard, and we're at the point in the year we're saving his legs for the next game. That's kind of out the window, right? There were definitely games this year where Leonard could have been running more to either move the chains or get a big first down. You're in the passing game because you need to be a little bit more conservative. That's out the window. I mean, the way he picked up the 3rd down to kind of ice the game, he's tumbling over the first down marker. They're going to be willing to do that. It's just a matter of, can they stay on schedule so that he is a running option? If they're suddenly, if they're going backwards on first down, he's less of an option to run, right? So that's where I think it goes. And the hope is, maybe if Love, who knows what his status is going to be. I'm sure none of us will know until they kick the ball. But if you can just get him in space for a couple opportunities, that might be enough to tilt the game. He's that dynamic if he has the space. I think the thing you're going to miss with him is he is really underrated between the tackles, running guys over. And I think that's probably where you're going to not see him as much. It'll have to be Price and Aeneas Williams, the freshman.
Then just to follow up, Tony, if the run game is not there like it normally is for Notre Dame, is Riley Leonard good enough from what you've seen to win a game with his arm?
Yes, I think he is. Now, that said, I don't think if you could pick, you want to win this game with his legs. I think that's where he's most dynamic. I think he's the best running quarterback probably in the country, or at least certainly of any of the guys left. But when you look at what he's done, I think that so long as Notre Dame's not chasing the game, Notre Dame hasn't led by 2 scores, or sorry, they've not trailed by 2 scores yet this year. Their largest, they've been down by only 7 points. They've not been down by double figures at any point. I haven't seen them try to throw themselves back into a game yet. That doesn't mean they can't, but we just haven't seen them have to chase the game with the passing game. So I think he can. They've hit big balls. It's not as if he has been ever unable to hit some of these throws downfield. They've just gone this route of take what they're giving you, check it underneath, run it when you can, and we'll beat Georgia and we'll raise the Sugar Bowl. But if they fall down by 10, I think we're going to find out. And I think he's capable. I mean, this guy at the end of the day was still like at the top of draft boards not too long ago. The skill set is there. The bigger question probably is how do the receivers get open? You know, Jordan Faison is their probably most dynamic receiver right now. And he's a 2-sport athlete that plays lacrosse on the lacrosse team here. They've got to find a way to get guys streaking open against that Penn State secondary. And if it comes to that, that'll be the question. Can you get guys open in the passing game? Because I think if they are open, I think he can hit them. And I think he can get them in space.
It's so funny hearing you say that, because the narrative going into the college football playoff semifinals last year was, well, Michigan has not really trailed all year. They've played with the lead all year. J.J. McCarthy hasn't had to bring them back, and then ultimately had to against Alabama, and then Michigan walked it. It almost feels like this Notre Dame team is built similarly and has played similarly to the way that Michigan has last year in so many ways.
I've heard that comparison a lot going into this week, and it makes sense just with the way they're relying on the running game and the defense to kind of carry the torch. And then, yeah, you need a veteran, experienced, confident quarterback this time of year. I think it's naive to think that you're going to somehow win the national championship without your quarterback making huge plays at some point here down the stretch. But I think that, and I think Notre Dame fans, quite frankly, myself at times, maybe in my head included, early in the season, we're watching the film and you're like, how is this going to work? How is this going to work if the guy's not, throwing 60-yard bombs down the sideline or making these picture perfect throws? And then you wake up on your 13-1 and you've won your first major bowl game in 30 years. And you realize, well, there is a way to do this. It might not look the way that you have it in your head, but at this time of year, it doesn't matter. Yeah. You do it however you can get there. And I think everybody in the program, and now the fan base certainly as well, has just bought in. And they're just saying, let's jump on this guy's back and ride him. And if that means it's 14 carries for 80 yards in the Sugar Bowl and only 90 yards in the passing game, but we win by 2 scores, we'll take it every time.
Tony, we'll let you go here in a minute. But when I look at this game, look, 2 teams where the margin's going to be real thin. Both of them are disciplined teams, rarely make mistakes, good at getting off the field. Like 3rd down and short, a few 4th downs in the game, whether you're getting a touchdown or a field goal in the red zone, which team makes the big mistake or which team makes the big play on defense, maybe a special teams play. What ultimately decides it one way or the other?
It's a great question. I just looked at, okay, you guys are what? Penn State's 70% on 4th down. Notre Dame's 73% on 4th down. I mean, I'm with you that I think it's going to be the smallest of margins. Notre Dame special teams, I think, are electric. They, of course, have the kick return in the last game, but it's these fakes that Marcus Freeman's been willing to run from deep in their territory. They ran the crazy one to get him off sides against Georgia. But it's these other fakes that they're flipping the ball to a former quarterback who's now the holder, who's throwing it on 4th and 7 from their own 27. He's coaching in a way that is just fearless. So I think, obviously, if you just told me now who's going to win the game and you told me who wins the turnover battle, I'll take that team. I mean, that's the margin, right? I can't imagine a team winning this game that loses the turnover battle, certainly if they lose it by multiple turnovers, right? So certainly that's going to be huge. And that's going to come down to, is one of these quarterbacks going to make that mistake that they haven't really made a whole lot this year? That's going to hurt you, right? Because especially is that defense going to take it back the other way? That might be your best way to get points in this game, right? Whether it be on defense or in special teams. So I think it will be the fourth down battle, the turnover battle, special teams. Does someone have a huge fake, or is there a broken coverage or a kick or punt return? And then, of course, field goal. I mean, Mitch Jeter, Notre Dame's kicker this whole year, he was perfect last year at South Carolina before transferring. Then he was 6 of 11 coming into the playoffs with 3 kicks blocked. And it was like, oh my gosh, who knows what's going to happen? He missed I think a 27-yarder at USC. And you're just thinking, what's going on here? And then he's been nails in the playoffs, made everything he needed to in the Sugar Bowl, all from 40 plus. But we were watching the Texas ASU game, balls going off the uprights. I mean, it's just anything can happen this time of year. Yeah. And I always get a little bit queasy when I see these games come down to kickers, because it's just, that's so much for someone to have on their shoulders. But as you know, it could come down to just someone in their early 20s having to kick a ball between the 2 uprights to decide the fate of 2 entire football programs. It's crazy.
It's so funny that you talk about Marcus Freeman and coaching fearlessly, because after the Ohio State game this year for Penn State, we noticed James Franklin's mindset and approach change a little bit, where they're at Minnesota and they need a big 4th down to extend a drive, and they ran a fake field goal. And later on in that drive, instead of putting the defense back out there or punting it or trying a field goal to go up 4, kept the offense out there and won it on their terms. And he's done that a couple of times now over the last month, where they start to coach. It's almost like coaching to win instead of coaching not to lose in some ways. I think there's so many what makes this matchup great is, number one, all the history, haven't played since 2007, and 2 iconic brands playing in an Orange Bowl to go to the national championship. But I think the narratives and the parallels between the 2 programs and where they're at with the coaches, trying to be among the elite of college football and finally break through for programs that haven't won the title since the 1980s. I think there's so much between the 2 that's nearly identical in many ways. It just makes this matchup so fascinating to me.
Yeah, you said it very well. There's definitely parallels, with what you pointed out. And I know what's this year for Franklin? Is this 9th year, 10th year?
11. Yeah.
11th year. Goodness gracious. So he's got more built up there. There's probably more weighing on Penn State, quite frankly, just with his tenure there. But both have been, at least down the stretch, like you said, they're coaching in a way that is like, we're going for it. And I think that you as a fan or as a player on the team, you can go to sleep at night if you lose and you went for it. I mean, if the fake punt doesn't work, but it's a great design and something just whatever, it doesn't go your way, you come up short of this, you went for it. If you go for it on 4th down, you get stopped because a better athlete comes through the hole and hits you. I think what Marcus Freeman, he played under Coach Tressel, and he's given Jim Tressel a ton of credit for how he views and sees the game, but he certainly does not coach his team in game situations the way they would have at Ohio State back in the mid-2000s. They're punting on 4th and 1, and they're going to let the linebackers come out there, and he and Laurinaitis are going to hit you and force you for 3 and out. We're going to try again. No, at 4th and 1 at midfield, they're going to go every time. And I think that builds a ton of belief on the sideline. And to your point, the evolution there after that Ohio State game, I think it's going to be a great coaching matchup. And I think the two coaches are going to have a huge part to play, because those decisions are going to be scrutinized, obviously. And whoever gets the, more of those decisions right is going to tilt the scales in their favor a whole lot.
Oh, I'm so jacked up. I'm ready. Is it Thursday already? Man, I am.
I know, right?
Get me to South Beach. Let's go.
We'll be thinking of you, Ryan, since we'll be there and you're not.
I know.
Yeah, well, thanks for rubbing it. I'm looking at the snow outside. Hey, you really got to rub it in that much? Thanks.
You can't fly down?
He's credentialed for the national championship game. He's going no matter who's playing.
Oh, well, I'll see you there.
Let's go, Tony. All right. Oh.
It took him a second to pick up on that one. Hey, Tony, thanks for carving time out today. I know it's a rare day at home with the family, so we really, really appreciate almost a half an hour from you. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in Miami.
All good. Baby's taking a nap. We're in the office here. This is a great reprieve from helping out around the house. So it's great talking to both of you guys. Brian, I'll see you in Miami. Ryan, I'll see you in Atlanta. This is perfect.
I will not see you there, Tony. I appreciate it.
Great stuff from Tony Simeone, the play-by-play voice of Notre Dame, the Irish radio network, their play-by-play voice, and someone that I've known for a long time. Ryan, all kidding aside about whether you're attending the game or not, I think the last point there about the parallels between the 2 programs, like as he started to talk about it, and the comparison to Michigan last year, the comparison between Freeman and where Notre Dame is, it really is two teams that in some ways are mirror images of each other, not just in terms of on the field play, where I don't think there's much differentiating factors there, but also where they're at currently in the landscape of college football.
Like you said, like it is crazy when you think about it, with national championships coming in the 80s, the lastly for both. Like it is like the history, both teams kind of being known for having good regular seasons, but then getting to that big game and never getting over the hump. It is wild, like how similar these two teams are. And now to face here off in the semifinal with the winner going to the national title. I mean, there's obviously clearly so much on the line just from that aspect. But like you said, when you add in the history, when you add in kind of a lot of the narratives surrounding both coaches, more Franklin than Freeman, because Franklin's been there longer, but the narratives and the thought around both programs going in, it's monumental. That's what I said. I'm ready to go. Like I am ready to put the ball down, tee it up. Let's go. If you need a play or two, James, I'm ready to go. Like, I'm just get me to Thursday night. Let's go, Tripp. Let's go.
You know, but listening to that conversation, we gave our picks on the podcast on Monday where we felt like Penn State has more avenues to win the game. I don't know that hearing from Tony and all the expertise, like it's a good Notre Dame team. I still don't know that my opinion changed on the way the game plays out.
I agree, because in large part, I know Tony said he didn't really see it this year. I just don't buy, and I got to believe it. I got to see it, I should say, to believe it, that Riley Leonard, if he's asked to throw the ball 30 times in a game, if the run game is not there, that he can do it. I just don't buy into it. I have questions at receiver, and so does Tony, it seems like, as well. So, like, there are multiple questions about Notre Dame's pass game to where if Jeremiah Love is not 100%, and doesn't seem like he's going to be, we'll see how effective he is, but if he's not effective in this game and the run game is slowed down for Notre Dame, they have not shown you an ability to do anything else. And in fairness to them, they haven't really been forced to do something else because they've been able to run the ball for the most part all season long. So now the question too is, well, can you do it? We've seen Penn State be battle tested. We've talked so much about the USC game, the Wisconsin game, even the Oregon game and the loss. Like they have been through the fire and the ringer, and they think have proven themselves, hey, we can win games in different ways, and we've been tested. Notre Dame has really not been tested in the sense of if the run game is shut off, can you win through the air? And to ask your quarterback in a national semifinal to do something he's not been asked to do, these receivers, the same thing, nothing they've been asked to do this season, to now do it for the first time on this stage, I don't think it will go well for Notre Dame. I'm with you, Tripp. Like I said, like we just look at the outline of where this game is won. I still feel good about the avenues for Penn State versus Notre Dame.
Yeah, I was surprised his initial reaction too when you asked him about how important Jeremiah Love was to that offense and everything that they want to do offensively. And to expand on your previous point, I still think there's this air of unknown about both teams in this game, right? Penn State's path to the national semifinals was through SMU and Boise State, where they were big favorites, 2-possession favorites in each of those games. So in many ways, you saw it against Oregon, but it was a losing effort. Sure, you saw the comeback against USC, but it was a tight game on the road against a team that was just over 500 at the end of the year. Wisconsin didn't make a bowl game. They had to find a way to get it done. They played a tough Ohio State team, but even that, you come out of it like, okay, you didn't get it done in the red zone. So I still think there's this air, as well as Penn State has played, particularly the evolution of their run game offensively, the evolution of their offensive line. I think the growth and maturity of their quarterback, there still remains a little unknown about them too, where sure, SMU and Boise, and I was asked this by someone else this week, they're top 10 teams. Does that change the narrative around James Franklin in a big game? And while I think the answer is yes, I still think there's still that little subconscious part of a fan's mind or anyone's mind covering the team, covering the game, covering college football. Like, okay, you can do it, but actually, can you do it? And
Right.
Until they win it against a Notre Dame, against an SEC team or a fellow Big Ten team like an Ohio State or Oregon, they still have to prove they can do it. So that to me kind of looms over this on both sides, where Notre Dame, okay, yeah, they did it, I guess, against Georgia. But you look at the end of their regular season since then, it's not like they've been tested a ton either. So I think that hangs over probably a little bit more of Penn State than Notre Dame because of Notre Dame beating Georgia. but that element's still there. And the one thing we just briefly mentioned the other day when talking about the health of Carter is Penn State's had 2 additional days to prepare for this game. Their fans had 2 additional days to buy tickets for this game, and they knew where they were going to be. So what kind of advantage does the potential crowd for having more time to book flights and buy tickets and preparation, rest, recuperation, what kind of advantage does that give them in this game?
No, you're right. And also, too, with some of the injuries Notre Dame has suffered, they are thinner as well, outside just the Love and the Carter injuries for both sides. They're thinner as well, losing Riley Mills, one of their outstanding defensive linemen in the Indiana game. So, yeah, there's just a lot more questions I have for Notre Dame, like you said. And Tony did a great job breaking it down and giving us a great perspective from Notre Dame's view. I still, like I said, my viewpoint of this game when we talked about it on Monday's pod hasn't changed a little bit. I still feel like this is a double-digit win here for Penn State. And I think they are, again, as long as the big thing, right, Tripp? As long as they don't beat themselves, which, Al Golden's going to try his best to confuse Drew Aller and get some balls on the ground and pick some off. Maybe Marcus Freeman's going to try to steal a possession or two with special teams, a fake, whatever. But if Penn State can just not beat themselves, it feels very difficult right now for the path for Notre Dame to get this win.
So similar thoughts for both of us on Notre Dame Penn State, Thursday, 7:30 in the Orange Bowl at Hard Rock Stadium in beautiful, warm, sunny, actually not that warm. I have a sweatshirt packed, Miami, Florida for the game as we record this a couple days in advance because of my travel schedule. Fozzy Whittaker, former Texas standout, now works on the broadcast team covering the Longhorns all season long, joins us to talk about this matchup in the Cotton Bowl between Ohio State and Texas for the right to go to the national championship.
As promised, welcome back into Still Enrolled. Ryan Hickey, Brian Tripp with you here, and let's welcome on Fozzy Whittaker, former Texas running back, a part of that 2009 Texas team that made it to the national title. Now does a great job covering college football for Sirius XM. Fozzy, thanks so much for kind of going behind enemy lines with us here and giving us a few minutes here on Still Enrolled.
Absolutely, man. It's a pleasure being on the show, and I'm excited for both the semifinal game matchups as they get ready to unfold. And what a great time to be watching college football this year.
Absolutely. It's been a really fun year. Really should be highlighted by these 2 semifinal games. Where I want to start with you is actually a tweet from one of the shows you work on, Third and Longhorn, that caught me by surprise at least. And it read, quote, "Can the underdog Longhorns shock the world?" And like when you hear like shock the world, at least for me, like I reserve my mind or go to like Appalachian State beating Michigan or this year NIU beating Notre Dame, right? You wouldn't think to use those terms when talking about Texas in a semifinal game. But here we are. So I'm curious, going into this game, in your mind, what's the gap, or how wide is the gap, maybe I should say, between Texas and Ohio State?
Yeah, I think from a talent perspective, the gap is non-existent. I think these two teams are very close to equal from a standpoint of 5-star, 4-star blue chip ratio ratings, as well as the level of production that we've been able to see from a lot of the big time players that have stepped up and made big time plays whenever their numbers needed to be called. You got national award winners on both sides. You got guys that'll be expected to be drafted. I looked at Pro Football Focus, and they mentioned there are close to 27 guys that'll possibly be draftable in this game alone between these two teams. So the talent level is there. The level of production by both of these teams are there. And I think the gap more so comes from the level of consistency that these two teams have played at as of late in the previous 2 games. Ohio State's been very consistent. They've started from the jump and they finished all the way to the end. And it hasn't just been an offensive showcase. It's been the defensive side as well that has been able to hold their own and really be the most dominant defense in college football, as what they have been all season long. The offense is catching up and getting a chance to showcase who they are. And is obviously led by Will Howard, who's had a phenomenal season, and Jeremiah Smith, the way that he's been able to develop and just be the man-child that he is. They have really unlocked the offense that Chip Kelly probably envisioned he wanted to run while at Ohio State. And on the flip side, Texas, they find themselves in a lull. And I think in the third quarters, that's where Texas has been very vulnerable. You obviously got to see that in the matchup against Arizona State. You got to see that as well in the matchup against Clemson, where Clemson turns it into a 7-point game. And just second halves overall, Texas has not been as dominant as they have shown the case to be in the first half in a lot of their games, even throughout the season. Whenever Texas played Michigan, they scored one time in the second half, and the game still was out of reach. But you would want this Texas team, whenever they get a chance to put their foot down on somebody's throat, go ahead and do that and go full throttle. That's what Ohio State has been able to do consistently. Texas, I'm still waiting to see them do that against a higher opponent foe that'll match up very similar to what talent level is on both sides of the ball.
It's funny, Ryan, when you were talking about David knocking off Goliath, the one matchup you didn't mention was Michigan beating Ohio State this year, where no one gave Michigan a chance. Fozzy, just want to get your perspective really quick. Obviously, we want you to break down Texas, but kind of as an outsider looking into the Big Ten, after that Michigan game, there were so many questions about Ohio State. When you watch them against what they did to Tennessee and Oregon in their 2 playoff games, what stands out to you the most about what they've been able to do?
Yeah, number one, they're a completely different team. I think whenever we talk about the game and how big of a magnitude the game is, between those two teams, it has a history in and of itself. And those two teams know exactly what's on the line and what's at stake whenever you're playing in a big rivalry game. It's very similar to whenever Texas goes to Dallas and plays against Oklahoma in the Red River rivalry game. And so much is at stake. The difference is that's in the middle of the season versus the last game of the year. That kind of sticks with you and it stings a little bit more. And Ohio State has had to wear that stinging badge for the past 4 times that they've played against Michigan. And this one probably hurt the worst considering what was at stake with the Big Ten championship and opportunities to possibly have a first round bye in the playoffs and what they wanted to do as far as where Michigan was from a down perspective and where Ohio State was expected to finish throughout the course of the season. I actually picked Ohio State to play in a national championship at the very beginning of the year because I thought this roster was that talented and I thought they could put it all together from a coaching perspective. They still have that opportunity, but it took a big blow whenever they lost to Michigan. And I think the confidence level for many across the country kind of dipped and waned a little bit on what Ohio State can be. But then you mentioned the past 2 playoff games that they've been a part of. And that's the Ohio State team, the potential, the opportunities that we saw. That's the team that everybody expected Ohio State to be the entire season. And there were bits and flashes throughout the course of the regular season, but they're peaking and putting it together at the right time. And I think whenever you have that level of degree where they're able to play complementary football to the degree that they've been able to play at, it makes them the most dangerous team out of the 4 left in this playoff. And really the best team and the best looking team to be able to showcase who they really are and how much they've grown and improved since they played against Michigan back in early December.
Fozzy, earlier you talked about the lull Texas has been in, right, in the third quarter, really the second half of games. When Brian and I were previewing this game on our Monday podcast, we were kind of talking about, I don't see a path to victory for Texas if that lull continues here in the second half, just with how well Ohio State's playing, and right now, offensively, defensively, how much they're clicking. So it's a twofold question here. First, you mentioned it's been a season-long problem. Why? Number one, why has there always been a second half and especially a third quarter lull? And 2, at this point in the season, going to Friday, is there anything you see that they can change to prevent that, to where they can come out of halftime firing the way they usually start games, which is pretty hot?
Well, part of the lull to begin with on the first half of the question is you got to be able to run the ball effectively. Whenever Texas has bypassed that lull, it's because they've been able to have that complementary style offensive approach that allows them to control the clock, pick up first downs, get them in third and manageable, second and manageable. And that's where Quinn Ewers does his best work whenever he has opportunities to utilize the play action to his degree. He's able to find Gunnar Helm on those deep crossing routes. And now his favorite go-to target, Matthew Golden, has been able to benefit tremendously from whenever Texas is able to run the ball effectively. Over the course of the season, that has been ups and downs, and I think that's directly correlated with the lulls that Texas has experience, because whenever you get into that second and long, third and long situations and scenarios, it's favorable to the defense. The defense has an opportunity to pin their ears back. And I know Steve Sarkisian loves to run the screen game, but you can only screen so much to be able to pick up a first down whenever it's a longer distance. And then being able to protect Quinn Ewers in the pocket as well. That defense, pin their ears back, send some of those exotic blitzes, try to get the offense to play on their heels rather than on their toes. And the best way to effectively mitigate that is be able to control the line of scrimmage and punch somebody in the mouth in the run game. And so I think there's the direct correlation of not being able to run the ball as effectively as they would like in the third quarter, being able to create some of those explosives, get them in those second and third and manageable situations and scenarios to be able to carry over some of the momentum that they may have had in the first and the second quarter. Now, in regards to your second part of the question, if they have that type of lull against Ohio State, I fear this game can get ugly, and then get ugly in that third quarter, because Ohio State has shown the tendency to not let up no matter what the issues are. And I think the way to continue to fix that is being complementary, like I said, with the run game as well as the pass game. But Texas has to be able to get off the football field defensively as well. As much as we talk about how good Texas's defense is, they're only as good as the offense allows them to be, because if they're on the field for 45 minutes, similar to what they were against Arizona State, that defense gets worn down and they get tired. And that's when a lot of those big plays happen, like Cam Scatterboo was able to rip off as a great player that he is. So the defense got to be able to get the opposing offense, Ohio State in this case, they got to get them into third and long situations, change the coverage looks up on the snap, try to confuse Will Howard, something that Michigan was able to do pretty well, mixing up that coverage. Cover two was something that was mixed in quite often as well, having that underneath coverage with somebody over top of Jeremiah Smith and Emeka Ibuka, and then also being able to mitigate the run. And I think that's where this game will be won or lost, is who can control the line of scrimmage from a run game perspective. Ohio State's doing it at a great clip. It's a tall task for Texas, but if they can contain and mitigate some of the bigger gains that Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins have put together, then that allows that defense to hopefully play a little bit more freely, play a little bit faster, where I think Ohio State can be slightly vulnerable. And same thing goes for Texas. If Texas isn't running the rock very effectively, we saw that firsthand with Georgia in the first game. We saw that firsthand again with Arizona State. Whenever Texas can't run the rock, they become one-dimensional. Defenses are able to pin their ears back, create sacks, create turnovers, and that's not the recipe for success for either one of these offenses.
No, and that's something Ohio State has done incredibly well in the playoffs with their outstanding defensive line. And I think Sawyer and JTT, and rightfully so, deserve a lot of credit. But they're so good up the middle with Malik Williams and Hamilton as well. I thought they made life miserable for Dylan Gabriel. How does that Texas offensive line match up with Ohio State's really, really talented defensive front?
You know, ironically, I think this type of style of the players that Texas is going to see might favor it a little bit better versus last week. You had smaller, undersized Arizona State defenders that were quicker and a little bit more, like, I wouldn't say explosive, but they had a little bit more of that first step twitch that allowed them to disrupt some of the run game that Texas was trying to implement. Now, Arizona State's defensive line is nowhere near as good as Ohio State's line, but it was different because what Texas sees on a weekly basis is more similar to what Ohio State has as far as who they'll be rolling out on the starters and the guys that'll be rotating in. So I think it's a little bit more of a familiar face from a standpoint of talent, from a standpoint of size, the weight, kind of what guys will be doing. That doesn't necessarily favor Texas by any degree, but it does give them a sense of familiarity with some of the guys that they'll be seeing versus having to go up against a completely stylistic type of player that they saw against Arizona State, where the biggest defensive lineman that Arizona State had was around 280 pounds. So I think they'll be able to be a little bit more comfortable from a standpoint of how they want to attack, but it's obviously going to be a lot harder being able to implement the blocks and sticking on guys more consistently for a prolonged period of time, whether that's in the run game or protecting Quinn in the pocket to be able to make sure that the offense stays clicking on all cylinders.
My other follow-up on the offensive side to something you were talking about is obviously Gunnar Helm is a key target for Quinn Ewers. We've seen Ohio State do a great job against Penn State's Tyler Warren this year and Oregon's Terrence Ferguson, two of the better, obviously, tight ends in the country. How important is Gunnar Helm to Texas's offense, and what can they do to make sure he's a big part of it against a very good Ohio State defense?
Well, I'll say this. Gunnar Helm didn't have any catches throughout the first half of the Arizona State game, and he really didn't get involved until the fourth quarter and then the 2 overtime periods. If Texas does not have Gunnar Helm, Texas does not win, or they would not win a lot of the games that they were able to win over the course of this season. Gunnar Helm is that big of an impact player for this team. He does the little things that he doesn't necessarily get the praise for, right? Everybody talks about his catching ability. Everybody talks about him being able to hurdle guys and what he's able to do with the ball after he catches it. But he's an integral part of the run game as far as a physical blocker is concerned and what he's being asked to do. He does that dirty work very well. And that benefits him because now the play action works extremely well because a lot of linebackers bypass him thinking he's run blocking and he finds a way to slip back behind him. Same thing happens with some of the safeties that have tried to match up against Gunnar Helm. And Steve Sarkisian, being the brilliant play caller that he is, he schemes up defenses to allow Gunnar Helm to have those one-on-one opportunities with the matchup that's favorable for Texas's offense. So he's the key to unlocking that Texas offense, whether it's in the screen game, whether it's in the run game, or whether it's in the pass game, including the play action effect. But Gunnar Helm has to be big if Texas wants to have a chance to be able to solve the riddle that Ohio State's defense provides.
What's your confidence level in Quinn Ewers, Fozzy? Like if the run game is dried up again, like let's say it was against Arizona State, is Quinn in your mind good enough in this game to be able to win the game with his arm?
Quinn is good enough. He's talented enough to be able to win the game with his arm. I don't think Texas as a whole would be talented enough to be able to overcome being one-dimensional. And I think those are two different aspects of evaluating who Quinn is, what he is. Whenever Quinn's healthy and he's playing at an extremely high level like he was able to do against Arizona State, that's the Quinn that's extremely dangerous. Whenever he's injured and he's not able to be his full self or he doesn't have the opportunity to be completely confident with the oblique and the ankle injury that he sustained over the course of this season, then that Quinn is one that can be rattled, shaken up, pressured, and not having an opportunity to utilize his kind of improvisation on some of the plays. And that is where Texas really gets in trouble offensively whenever he's not at his best. I believe with some of the extended time that he's been able to experience, he's continuously healing up on that ankle. He had a rushing touchdown against Arizona State and moved outside of the pocket probably the most since before the injury against Kentucky. And I think that bodes well for the confidence that he expects going into this game, knowing that he's going to need every bit and piece of his game, whether it's with his legs, with his arms, or his mind, being able to put Texas in the best place possible against the defense that Ohio State lines up. That Texas team is going to need that. But if Quinn is not confident in feeling the way that he's supposed to, then it's something that I fear Texas would not be able to overcome against the talent level and the execution by how good this Ohio State defense is.
Fozzy, you know the Texas talent on defense as well as anyone. It's an exceptional defense. You talked about the importance of winning up front. But if you're trying to scheme up a way to slow down Ohio State and everything they can do with that two-headed monster at running back, all those wide receivers, Will Howard, where do you start? Like what's the avenue for Texas having enough success defensively? Not maybe shut them down, but enough success that gives them a chance to win the football game.
number one, you start with stopping the run. That's where everything is predicated off of the success of this football team. Chip Kelly, he loves to run the rock. And whenever you're able to run the rock, ask any offensive coordinator or any head coach, your playbook is completely open. You can call whatever you want to call. And we get to see some of those shifts and fancy motions and plays that Chip Kelly likes to do. And Steve Sarkisian does it as well. Whenever you're able to run that rock, it truly softens up that defense, and it puts them in a state where if they don't stop the run, then you're just going to keep gashing and continuing to do that for 200 plus yards. I think the recipe that I saw Michigan have, and I bring up that game just because it's the most recent one where we saw a defensive game plan work to the degree that they needed it to work in order to win the game, was they held that Ohio State team under 100 yards rushing. They pretty much kept them in check. And there's talented players on that roster for Michigan that'll be drafted and playing in the NFL next year. Same thing can be said about Texas, right? Why can't Texas do some of the similar things that Michigan was able to do that allowed them to have that success? And whenever you're able to contain Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins, it really puts a little bit more pressure on Will Howard, who has had a phenomenal season, has been one of the stellar quarterbacks within the country. But this Texas team is familiar with playing against Will Howard in the same way Will Howard's familiar with playing against this Texas team. Whenever Texas has beaten Will Howard, it was because they were able to get after the quarterback. But the only way you're able to get after the quarterback and move him off of his spot is by stopping the run. Otherwise, everything within that playbook, like I said, is wide open. And Will Howard has thrived off of play action this year. Those two running backs both having over 900 yards rushing and 10 touchdowns, and each of them apiece, having 20 total rushing touchdowns between those two guys. That really opens up the game plan for them to utilize Jeremiah Smith in one-on-one opportunities, because defenses are having to rotate, bring down the safety, and really load up the box in order to try to limit the explosiveness that those two running backs have been able to put together. So you got to stop the run, and I think that's the number one goal that Texas needs to implement if they want to have any sort of success against this offense, whether it's going up against Will Howard and Jeremiah Smith and Emeka Buka, Scott and Carnell Tate. It doesn't matter. It's all about stopping the run first and then being able to control the line of scrimmage whenever you get your opportunities.
And you look at Ohio State's success this postseason, 6 rushing touchdowns in these 2 games. So a lot of questions about their offensive line. They've had no problem, at least in these 2 playoff games so far, of getting a good ground game established and finding the end zone. Yep. Last question for me, Fozzy. When you look at this game overall, offensively, defensively, is there a matchup you have identified that says, okay, if Texas is going to win this game, this is the matchup they have to take advantage of?
Well, it's just what I mentioned, is that defensive line against Ohio State's offensive line. Number one, can Texas play with a lighter box? Can they have 2 linebackers, Anthony Hill Jr. and Leonga Lafau, play in there in the sub package or the sub personnel, with Chip Kelly being in sub quite often, to be able to say, hey, our 6 are going to be able to mitigate what you plan to do whenever you got those running backs in there. And Ohio State, probably where they are weakest is at the offensive line position. Obviously experienced some of the injuries, but at the same time, they've been able to perform admirably and have done a phenomenal job over the course of these past 2 playoff games. Number one, protecting Will Howard, not giving up any sacks. And then number 2, creating those big explosive run lanes where you got guys averaging over 10 yards a carry. You got multiple touchdowns by both of these guys, and they're kind of doing it at will against some really good defenses. So I think ultimately that Texas defensive line, as well as those 2 inside backers, that front 7, is the matchup that I'll be watching closely to see if they can create some pressure in the run game, disrupt that run game without having to get a secondary member involved, which will allow you to stay in a cover 2 high-low look with Jeremiah Smith, so that you kind of got 2 guys on him at all times.
Fozzy, before we let you go, I know weather could be an issue with travel, and they're talking about snow and ice in Dallas. The forecast kind of changes a little bit day by day, but it certainly isn't going to be warm, and it's not going to be easy to get in and out of the city. How much of a home field advantage do you expect Texas to have, and can it be enough that it's a significant difference maker in the game?
I think the home field advantage is a real thing. A lot of people are actually driving to Dallas today or flying out to Dallas today to avoid some of that weather that'll hit in the morning in Austin as well as in Dallas. And then there's a big Dallas proponent of Texas fans already located within the city. So that's going to be a sea of burnt orange across the entire stadium, I'm quite sure, with the travel being very minimal. Now, as far as the effect, I think on third downs for Ohio State, they'll be able to hear it. But ultimately, I don't think it'll impact the game quite that much, right? The players are the ones that ultimately decide what happens on the football field and the outcome of that game. The fans support and help the players, but at the end of the day, those players are the ones that make the plays. And it's no different than an away game for Texas or an away game for Ohio State, home game for Texas, home game for Ohio State. Like, you still got to show up and play. And I think that's going to be the ultimate goal of who creates the turnovers, who's able to create and control the turnover and win the turnover margin, who can stop the opposing team from establishing the run game. And I think those two things are really the key to success, no matter if the crowd's in it or not. If you can do those two things, you got a good chance of being successful in winning the game.
Fozzy, awesome stuff. We can't wait for these two semifinal games. I'm already in Miami for the playoff game between Penn State and Notre Dame, Ohio State and Texas. You have 4 blue blood programs with great fan bases. And I know ESPN is salivating over the ratings that they're going to get in these games as well. Thanks so much. That was awesome.
Absolutely. It should be a phenomenal time. And I wish I was waking up in 57-degree weather.
Take care, Fozzy.
All right. Y'all have a good one.
That was awesome, Tripp. Fozzy, really do appreciate his insight into this game. I think it's interesting because we kind of talked about it on Monday, and he mentioned it, like the lull Texas has in the second half, and that's part of the concern, and that's part of the reason why we both are right now believing in Ohio State and feel pretty strong about their ability to win. And it's just the fact that, like, Texas is going to need so much to go right. When you hear Fozzy basically say, in order for Texas to have a chance to win this game, it's going to be, decided by the offensive line of Ohio State versus the defensive line of Texas. I'm with him. And right now, it's crazy to say, right? But with how Ohio State's offensive line is playing, despite I think this being the toughest matchup, I feel confident in their ability to at least hold their own in this game and not be the reason why they lose.
Yeah, it's funny that you say toughest matchup, though, because against Tennessee, I thought that was the area that Tennessee had the advantage. I thought that was the area that Oregon, with their outstanding edge rushers, had the advantage. And I have no reason to believe that I shouldn't give the benefit of the doubt right now to that Ohio State offensive line. And look, I think it's the players, and they deserve a lot of credit for it, but also the play calling, the rhythm, and the balance that they've gotten into throwing the football. And for Ohio State, they just look so darn good the last 2 games, right? Fozzy started to talk about, well, what's the formula for success for Texas defensively against Ohio State? Is it the same thing Michigan did? Is it the same thing Penn State did to them? Is it the same thing that Nebraska did to them? And how they were able to, in that span from late October through November, it was a different looking Ohio State team. But you saw the way this team moved the ball on the road in Eugene, and you've seen what they've done the last 2 games, especially the last 2 games. And it just feels like a different Ohio State team to all of that talent. Everything that he talked about right at the top, about how talented and how good they are and how balanced they are in all levels. Right now, I have no reason not to give them the benefit of the doubt that that's the same Ohio State team that we're going to see on Friday in Dallas.
Absolutely. And it's funny, like, we started the conversation talking about how, at least in some Texas fans' minds, it's like shock the world with a win. And it's crazy to think, like, in the semifinal, we're talking about this mega upset, but that's what it feels like. And so that leads me to this, Tripp. Let's just say Ohio State does lose. We kind of talked about this before. Like, if Penn State loses to Notre Dame, still a very successful season that will go down and be remembered by a lot of fans as a positive here in 2024. I think for Notre Dame fans, same thing. And I would say even for Texas fans, hey, you made the Final Four. If you lose to Ohio State, I think everyone, for those 3 teams, are calling it a successful season. If Texas is able to shock the world, let's say, Tripp, and take down Ohio State, would you call this season for the Buckeyes a successful one?
It's going to be funny because they're not going to have anything in their trophy case at the end of the day to prove that it was a successful season. Certainly a Rose Bowl championship is nice, but when you look back, you're going to think no Big Ten championship, still didn't get over that hurdle of beating Michigan and ending that 3-year losing streak, and then also no national championship, not even berth, but national championship trophy that they have at the end of the year. So, man, it's a really difficult question, but I think if you look at it through a vacuum, the answer would be no. But if you look at what they did the last 2 weeks against Tennessee and Oregon to win a Rose Bowl championship and prove the type of team they had, and that is as talented as any team in the country, I think because they finally played to their potential the last 2 weeks and won the Rose Bowl, if you lose in the national semifinal from where your season was a month and a half ago to where it is now, I think it might take a while to sink in, but I do think it's a successful season for Ohio State to make it all the way to the Final Four in this 12-team playoff and having to get there by playing 2 games to get to the semifinals.
To me, I think it'd be a failure. In part, number one, what you said, right? You're 0 for 3 in terms of then your goals. What does Ryan Day always say? The 3 goals every year: beat Michigan, win the Big Ten, win a national title. 0, 0, 0. You're 0 for 3, and like you said, outside of Rose Bowl trophy, that trophy case for 2024 is empty. And then also too, like you go back to the preseason, and I get expectations change, right, as things go on. The offensive line injuries maybe change the way you view this team, but this was, right, head and shoulders the most talented team in all of college football. A lot of people are picking them to win a national title. Hell, you have Jim Tressel, Urban Meyer calling this maybe the most talented team they've ever seen at Ohio State. To have that team not result in at least appearing in a national title game, and especially with how well they're playing, and it feels like now at this point, it feels like inevitable. Like we're talking about Ohio State as the best team remaining of the 4. If they lose, and it's one thing if you lose to a better team, like if you lose to Oregon, I feel like that's even more, it's easier to digest than losing to Texas, because now once you beat Oregon, it's, well, who the hell is beating Ohio State? And so when you look at the preseason expectations, the 0-4 when it comes to hardware, and now I think of the 4 teams remaining, by far being the best team, the one that most everyone is picking to win the national title, if you then fall short again and unable to reach the national title, let alone win the championship, I think you look back and say this year was a massive failure. They went all in for this, and they would come up short. It's crazy because didn't it feel like, Tripp, like once Ohio State beat Oregon, it's kind of like, okay, a lot of pressure's off Ryan Day, Monkey, like this team is rolling now. They feel loose, they feel free. But it's like the world can come crashing down if we're sitting here on Friday night, or in this our case, when we record our podcast on Saturday morning. Make sure you do, again, subscribe so you get that right away. But if we're sitting here talking about on Saturday morning, Texas beating Ohio State, it feels like all the pressure, all the scrutiny that seemingly evaporated after the Oregon game is going to come back tenfold.
Well, I don't think we're going to be having that conversation.
I would agree.
Let me put a bow on this entire podcast and discussion. You mentioned, you feel like Penn State's a success. There's still people out there that are going to say the Boise State and SMU's don't count because of who they are. SMU being a year and a half ago, still in the American Conference, Boise State being the Mountain West. We're both in that this is a success no matter what for Penn State, right?
Absolutely. I think for me, preseason, my expectation was just make the playoff. I don't care where you're seated, just get in. Then as the season went on, it's okay, win a playoff game. I think you got to win the SMU game. I think at this point, if you lose to Notre Dame, obviously I'll be upset and frustrated. But to your point, I think when you kind of take a step back, have it sink in a week later, 2 weeks later, kind of look back on the season, I think it's absolutely a success. We've never seen Penn State get this close to a championship, Tripp, since 1994? That can't be considered a failure.
Let me ask you this. Did your expectation, or at least your bar, change once they were in the playoff because of the path they had, that they had to get to this point for it to be successful?
Yes. Okay. Again, when you look at, like you said, SMU, Boise State, 2 teams that they were double-digit favorites against, you took care of business relatively smoothly as well. Right? SMU was never a game, and outside of a 5-minute stretch in the third quarter, really they were in control of that whole game against Boise State. That's part of the reason why, to your point, I think the pressure was on Penn State to get here. Now that they're here, if they lose to a team that we've talked about, Notre Dame, right, it's a very similar spot. Yeah. We talked with Tony, very feel like equally talented team. If you lose to Notre Dame in a tough 3-point game, it feels like, okay, like you can live with it. That's still a success and it was still all good. I think with right now, again, with Ohio State's expectations before the year, all the talent they have, and now the fact that they're playing their best football right now and just beating the brakes off of everybody, I think that to me is why there's a difference in how you perceive these seasons between Ohio State and Penn State. Would you agree?
Let's wrap up. No, I agree. I completely agree. Well, let's wrap up our national semifinal podcast with this. Just to reiterate for our audience, Saturday morning, you and I are talking about an all Big Ten national championship.
I think so. For the first time in the modern era, I tried to go back and when you look at the bowl games, it makes sense. This would be historic. And the Big Ten then, for the first time since 1966, would have repeat or I guess back-to-back national champions within the conference. This is a big weekend here for the Big Ten. Obviously, 2 teams within it. Yeah, Penn State's never been this close since what? Would you say 94, 86? Like, it's been a long time.
Like, for a Big Ten that we just had the conversation on Monday, are they the best conference in college football? It doesn't go as expected, and all of a sudden it's a completely different conversation we're having on Saturday. Like, yeah, Ohio State's favored, and I think everyone expects them to win. I think most people think it's a toss-up, Penn State, Notre Dame. I think Penn State has the slight edge, but we've talked about the paths to both teams winning the game. It's still a sport. And, it's great for us that we do shows and podcasts and can have these discussions and debates, but narratives change really, really quickly. But to your point, if the Big Ten can get both of these games and have an all Big Ten championship without the Big Ten champion playing in the Big Ten championship, in the national championship, right? That is kind of crazy. But yeah, I think we do. I think we see Ohio State and Penn State. I think that's who's left standing at the end of the next couple of days here. And I can't wait for it. I think it's going to be awesome. I'm not sure how I'm going to be able to work and broadcast the game without nervous like the fandom in me. But this is really, really cool. It's really cool. It's really special. And I'm sure even more so for I'm sure there's some of that been there, done that for like in Ohio State, but Texas, Notre Dame, Penn State really haven't been big players. Certainly been a part, Texas and Notre Dame, but haven't been the big movers and shakers in the playoff era. And now that you're down to 4, it feels like, okay, this is what we've experienced since they went to the 14 playoff. And for those 3 schools, they're getting to really, really experience it now. And this is big time. This is big time. I think it's going to be such a great 2 days of college football.
It is. It's going to be a lot of fun. One other thing I want to mention here quickly. I know, like you said, Ohio State's been there now twice in terms of winning a national title and then appearing in another national championship game back in 2020. So they're used to it. Penn State's not. But it does feel like now with the expanded playoff, and now you have 4 games or in case if you ever buy 3, but it's still like the path is longer. It almost feels more enjoyable because there's like an actual, you go through the journey where it's like in the 14th playoff, you wake up basically after a month off, you're in the CFP, and then it's like all of a sudden you win 1 game and now you're in the national title game. Well, it's for both fan bases, like, right. It's just like, excuse me, the journey being longer almost like makes it more fun and makes it in a way feel more real versus a 14 playoff where it is like get a month off. It's 1 game on New Year's Day. All of a sudden, boom, you win. You're in the national. It just feels like it goes by so fast.
Yeah. Kick the ball off. Let's go.
We are ready to go here. Enjoy the games on Thursday and Friday. Again, as a reminder, we'll be back on Saturday morning to record a reaction to both games, the Orange Bowl and the Cotton Bowl. Fingers crossed we're talking about an all Big Ten national title game. Either way, we'll be back here reacting to both of those games. So enjoy them. We'll talk to you on Saturday morning right here on the Still Enrolled podcast.